Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As has become very clear, I think, in this afternoon's session, we are all on a journey into a much more complicated world than any of us envisaged even 2-3 years ago. Now, on that journey, we need a vision, which I think Juan has very eloquently articulated and which the panel have discussed in some detail. But behind that vision, there needs to be something much more basic, some milestones and benchmarks, and what are the key issues and supply chain issues that allow us to maintain the core business at the same time as innovating and migrating and reinventing ourselves into somewhere else and some other form. And that is the thinking behind the Distripress Circulation Monitor, is to give some kind of map as to where we are as we track along this journey to a different place. There are 3 key inputs into the survey. The first is global sales trends, and we've gathered together data from all the available sources to come up with a volume estimate, and we've gone down the volume route. The volume of print copies sold over a 4-year period from 2011 through to 2014 is where we are at the moment. That's supplemented by a survey where we've polled the views of 188 Distripress members in 49 countries, and then zoomed in on 11 focus markets. They are Australia, France, Brazil, Canada, Germany, South Africa, Spain, Russia, USA, UK, and Belgium. So quite a wide range of countries. They've probably all beaten England in the World Cup already. But that gives more detail as to what is going on in those particular markets. The survey itself, which has become the report, which has become available this afternoon and is downloadable from the Distripress website, covers these 4 sections. The big picture of the global press context, moving round to the bottom-up picture across 70 countries in terms of the sales trends, sales volume. Then moving across, looking at some of the dynamics and issues of cross-border distribution, and then home market dynamics, looking at the shape of supply chains in the home markets of Distripress members, and all those things feeding into some of the key issues. It's a big report, and I'm going to scamper very quickly through it and hit you in a short period of time with lots of facts and figures, but hopefully to illustrate the depth of the data that is actually there. So let's kick off and look at the global press context. That is a picture of how Zenith Optomedia divide up the world. It's in basically by geography, but also by the performance of the economies and what they do then. And we're looking at this chart here, which takes those areas and divides them up into these slow growth, basically 3 groups: slow growth, steady growth, and fast growth in terms of advertising spend. And that is a very good indicator of the economic context in which the media in those countries are operating in. Those figures are Zenith's best estimate as to the annual growth rate each year in ad spend by region. So kicking off at the low end with Eastern Europe and Central Asia, under 1% per year growth in ad spend, going through from 2014 through to 2017. Largely driven by Russia and Turkey, 2 very volatile economies, and both of them at the moment showing slow recovery from fairly pronounced dips. So the prognostication is that is going to be fairly slow growth going forward. Then we've got a group of steady growth countries. Japan, which is stuck in a rut of slow economic growth, plus 2.5% year on year. Middle East and North Africa, political instability is slowing down their great potential for growth. USA and Central Europe, where we've got three groups that Zenith pull out. The first is the core Eurozone, driven by France and Germany, who are showing sluggish growth in their economies. The second band is of peripheral Eurozone, so that's places like Italy, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal, who are currently recovering from years of poor performance. And then there is the little island state of the UK, which is sitting there on its own and is one of the most digitally advanced countries in Western Europe and is driving quite aggressive growth rates, but very much down the digital route. We've then got advanced Asia, which includes Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, where, again, there are signs of recovery after several years of poor performance. And then North America, the first to be hit by the recession, the first to come out of it, and showing one of the most robust economies in the world. And then we come on to rapid growth. Latin America, plus 6.9%, massive potential, but very volatile from year to year, and currently dragged back by Brazil and Argentina with their current economic issues and slowdown. And then fast track Asia, which is dominated by China and India, but also quite strong growth markets in Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippines, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam. But essentially, the blistering growth of China slowing down very noticeably, whilst India is speeding up. So that is the broad context in which we are all operating in and will continue to operate in over the next few years. Moving then, say, where does that then drive from the bottom up in terms of the volume trends? Again, this is the engine room of the report. I'm going to give you a very quick overview as to what is actually in there, but let's look at the volumes. So looking from 2012, 2013, 2014, the year-on-year percentage change in print sales volumes. Now, that top line is newspapers, which is very, very positive because it's driven by China and India. China and India, between them, account staggeringly for 62% of the total volume of print copies sold of newspapers around the world, mainly because they're cheap as chips and they are almost given away. But it's a massive volume churn. Take that out, and that is what the underlying volume trend is for the rest of the world, excluding India and China. And then looking at magazines, lower than newspapers, newspapers showing a better trend, and behind those averages, the magazine business is much more erratic and volatile from country to country and from market to market. But a theme that comes through the report is that 2013 was a bad year for the press globally in terms of changes to supply chains, but also in terms of volumes, and the volume drop is slowing down its rate of fall in 2014, and the early indications we've had even more so in 2015. I'm going to go down a level now into the individual regions, and there's a lot of data on that chart. It's for paid-for print newspaper sales. It shows where the center of gravity is, which is Asia-Pacific for newspapers at the moment. 76% of total, the volume of sales coming from Asia-Pacific, mainly because of India and China, but also some positive growth behind that. Indonesia and Sri Lanka are two countries showing positive growth in Asia-Pacific in terms of newspaper sales. Japan and Australia are the other extreme. Their rate of decline is increasing in those two markets. Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe on the surface performing in a very similar way in terms of those a steady increase in the volume drop. But in fact, Central and Eastern Europe, as already hinted, is much more volatile from country to country. And then North America, Latin America, Middle East and Africa are all similar in showing a bad 2013 before an improvement, a slowdown in the rate of fall. Look at the picture for magazine sales, and again, a loaded chart. I just want to pick out a couple of key statistics. The main one being the center of gravity for the magazine business is the Western Europe and North America. It's the old, more mature markets rather than the emerging markets. 2013, again, the worst year like newspapers, the worst region like for newspapers is Western Europe, with Middle East and Africa very wobbly indeed, very up and down. But the volatility of magazines is a key theme of the report, which I think is highlighted in this chart here. This takes the 11 focus countries that I outlined before and looks at the volume of sales by magazine sector, comparing the first half of 2015 with the first half of 2014. A massive range, one market, so we've been talking a lot about premium. Puzzles are not the premium end of the market, but they are currently the only growth sector looking across these 11 countries. But a massive range, ranging down to a 40% year-on-year drop in foreign language publications. But the theme coming out of that does also emphasize what was said in the panel session about the premium sector. TV guides, minus 11%, women's interest, minus 12%. Those are steady, predictable, massive markets that are jogging along. Where there is much more growth and much more potential is in specials and collectibles. Now that, our definition of that is part works, one-shots, bookazines, sticker collections, build the Titanic out of matchsticks, those kinds of products that have very high value, very high premium status in terms of consumer pricing. And then specialist interest as well. So specials and collectibles only minus 1%, specialist hobby and leisure only minus 5%. So there are pockets already emerging where the sales are much more robust, even to the point of buoyancy, and that's on a volume basis. If you factor in value, then those figures improve considerably. So that's a quick dip into the volume side and the bottom-up side of the report. Let's move into this area of cross-border distribution and a few facts and figures about it. 6%, roughly, our estimate, 6% of total global press sales are cross-border. Now that varies massively from country to country. There are countries where 30–40% of consumer sales are with imported product. For most mature markets, and particularly in Western Europe, it's 1–2 or even 3% maximum. But that gives an indication of the scale. It's a significant niche, and 73% of cross-border sales volume are still in retail print. 20% and rising is print subscription, 7% of volume and rising is digital. If you look at it by value, digital drops away significantly because there's a lot of digital product which is not being paid for or has a very low price. So the message there, which has already come through from the discussion this afternoon, is that retail print is at the core of the business. We asked Distripress members, is your business itself, not the market, but your own business, is that growing or steady? 47% said their businesses were growing or steady, which is up from 39% in last year's survey. So there is a real improvement in the business performance of the companies involved in the supply chain from publisher through to retailer. 65% of publisher export operations are profitable. That's actually down year on year, so the bottom line profitability is being hit. It was 70% last year, it slipped a bit to 65%. And 85% of publishers have a promotional budget for export sales. That's edged down a bit, but there is much more stability in the size of the budget. That there is a real commitment from the publishers to hold their presence and their promotional spend in the markets they are already operating in. Now, there's a lot of detail in the report behind each of those facts and figures, but I think they highlight the general trends, and that there is a better feeling. We asked for all the companies in the Distripress survey to score themselves in terms of their confidence, and that is rising and improving as well in 2015 as opposed to last year's survey. We asked the Distripress members to rank the key influences that are driving their international press sales, both newspapers and magazines, to pick the top three factors. 56% picked tourists, the presence of a large tourist population and expat population. Interestingly, that's risen, that's jumped from number 4 last year to number 1 this year. The second area is the quality of the distribution network, which is ahead of the quality of the local retailer, but both of those are in similar positions to last year. Where there have been significant changes are on the economic side. So competitive cover pricing was number 7 last year. It's now up to number 4. More of that in a minute. And also the issue of consumer disposable incomes, which was way down at number 10 last year, but is felt to be becoming more of an issue. There is an issue about cover pricing in terms of have we reached a ceiling with the products that we have. So piecing all that together, there is a sense that international product is operating increasingly in its own market, that it is increasingly dependent on expats and on tourism rather than the local population to buy international press product. And therefore, that is where the consumer pricing issue comes in, I think, is it being priced beyond domestic product and is consumer pricing becoming more of an issue? We then asked for more open-ended, what do you see as the key opportunities to develop retail sales? A wider range of titles. Again, this comes back down to the whole personalization issue, to meet the increasing diverse consumer needs and interests on having just more and more titles. And there is felt to be potential to grow the number of retailers and to try and, if not grow actual retail space, to make more efficient use of it through the data tools that we have increasingly. Secondary issues, recovering tourist traffic, using digital positively. This is a new area which has come through in this year's survey. That a number of the middlemen, of the wholesalers and distributors, are trying to get their share of the digital edition supply chain and to get involved in that. It is also digital marketing, particularly the use of social media in order to promote international press within the local market, and also, and we've touched on it already in the panel session, of digital printing, but how far that will go and how big that will become is a question mark. But using digital positively is a much more positive and creative and lateral thought coming through this year's survey. Improving copy allocation through the data that is coming through, and then from a publisher perspective of moving into more rising markets. And Latin America is still high up the list as far as publishers are concerned. On the downside, what are the barriers? The obvious ones, the growth of digital, there being fewer retailers who take press and there being less retail space. There were the dominant themes of last year's survey and remain so. There are some new ones. Rising costs was there in last year's survey, but is edging up now in the number of mentions. That's in terms of the cost of transport to the local market, but also logistics within the market, of local cover prices being too high, and again, this varies significantly from respondent to respondent as to what is happening in terms of the local economy and tourism. There are more questions being asked. The wholesalers and distributors are asking, are publishers actually putting their money where their mouth is in terms of promotional support, but also the availability of copy? And I think it goes back to Mike's question from the audience, that publishers talk a good talk about investment, but are they actually putting it into that? And then flicking it around, there is more open questioning from publishers as to the service levels they are getting out of their wholesalers and distributors. There is more concern as to whether the cost cutting has hit service standards. But I think it's all summed up in that quote. We have to find new ways to promote the overall press category and to drive consumers. And I think this is a shift between this year's survey and last year's survey. Yes, supply chain issues are important, but the real issue is driving the consumer through. Quality displays, visibility in store, price-driven promotions, these are what we are focusing on now. And it's a shift, not seen yet in bigger budgets, but a shift in mindset towards the consumer. So I think that sums up what is going on in cross-border distribution. Zooming in now on what is going on generally in domestic supply chains, looking at your own home market, what is going on there? 78% of the countries reporting said that their retail universe for press products was shrinking. That is slightly less than in last year's survey. It was 82%. And the average looks to be running at about 2% down year on year. But that decline slowing in 2015. Again, 2013 seems to have been a very turbulent year in a number of markets, where it's not exactly settling down again, but there has been a hiccup. But the general trend is still down. Another area that we look into, we look at different retail types and which are growing and which are falling. The fascinating one is supermarkets. Supermarkets, as we all know, are influential and disruptive players. They affect margins, they drive new processes in the supply chain. They have a very different approach to range and display. And particularly in mature markets like the UK, the grocers are facing their own challenges and own disruption themselves. But that gives a fascinating indication. It's the percentage of magazine retail sales value accounted for by supermarkets from country to country. Generally, it is rising. It is rising still most strongly in the UK at the moment. It's plus 1 to 2 percentage points in share each year. 63% USA is crazy and scary. Spain, 5%, is just as crazy and scary, but for different reasons. A balanced supply chain portfolio is what is needed. But that's a fascinating indication as to what is going on in particular markets. We also asked respondents to come up with what they felt were buoyant channels and retailers. Supermarkets and grocery clearly come out top. But interestingly, in terms of number of mentions, travel points, that's airports, rail stations, motorway service stations, but where the consumer is moving, either commuting or on travel. And we asked members in each country to nominate. There's a list in each country, but here are some of the faces. That face in the top left is a rather smug-looking independent. What, interestingly, most of the Distripress respondents said was, it is very hard to beat a good independent press retailer. that they have the commitment and the passion, the good ones, to make a real difference. And as I say, there is one from the UK smiling sweetly at the camera. But in Medio, Barnes & Noble, here are some known names from around the world. And I think this, if the Circulation Monitor is to go down any kind of different route, I think sort of tracking best practice in terms of retail is a fascinating area and an area for future benchmarking. So what are the key retail trends? Very much the same as last year, shrinking retail universes, reducing ranges of pressed products as the pressure on display space comes more intense, fluid retail types. And this is causing particular problems in mature markets, the growth of convenience retailing, the decline in certain markets, in particular, UK being one of them, of the big hypermarket, supermarket for the smaller convenience shop. But the growth of supermarkets still in virtually every country, the growth of convenience, the weakness of independence, particularly of street kiosks, which in a number of markets are facing real financial difficulties. The erosion of press specialists as the generalists, the convenience store, grow their share. But interestingly, what comes through the verbatim comments is that there is more focus. Although the share is dropping, there is a realization amongst the Distripress members that more effort and thought and resource needs to be put into preserving that core of the press specialist, the range retailer, because if that becomes too weak and wobbly, then that undermines the whole supply chain. And a focus on non-traditionals, as publishers look to build as many contacts with the end consumer as possible, so going into things like coffee shops, garden centres, and places which traditionally do not stock newspapers or magazines. So looking now at some of the issues, 71% of the countries reporting are seeing change, 26% radical change. That's change to their supply chain structures. The 71% is pretty much last year's figure. What has altered is the radical change. That's up from 14% last year to 26% this year. The sense is that change is taking place faster now this year, noticeably faster than last year. One of the concerns is, and this is from publishers in particular, is instability amongst wholesalers and distributors. This issue of reducing service standards and also their underlying financial stability. But what unites everybody are the retail issues, the numbers, the competition for shelf space, the retail demands on margins and processes, and the share shifting from the independent sector into multiples. Some quotes: the supply chain we have now belongs to another world. It is too big and cumbersome and expensive to deal with the ebbing demand we are seeing. This sense that there is a need to review the processes and the systems, who does what for how much, and there needs to be some fundamental tidying up of the interfaces in order to make the system more agile and responsive, which is what this quote is about. The whole retail landscape is changing all the time, which means that our supply chain has to become much more agile and responsive than it is at the moment. But I think it also highlights another point, that I think when we talk about newspapers and magazines, we are obsessed about digital and and particularly digital content. For the current supply chain, what is an equally big issue is what's going on at retail. And there are some massive changes taking place in the retail universe and the shape of retailing around the world. And they are broadly similar. They're happening at different paces, but they are broadly similar as retailers grapple with a multi-channel world, from home delivery to click and collect to convenience versus big shop shopping. That the changes in retail are as big for Distripress members as are the digital ones. But here is some an indication of the more lateral thinking, we're about to start something we would never have contemplated a few years ago, a joint venture with our major competitor to build scale and efficiency. That is actually two wholesalers getting together to share a logistics service. So stuff that 10 years ago, circulation people were saying this gives us competitive advantage, I think a lot of people are now looking and saying, does that really give competitive advantage, or is the advantage so small in comparison to the cost benefits to build scale and efficiency? So scale economies, streamlined processes, but also more creative ideas in terms of retail promotions, and retail promotions which are increasingly being driven by digital contact, particularly through social media, with the local population. So that was open text. We allowed the members to come out and just say what they thought. Here we went back to specific issues and say, can you say on a grade of 1 to 10 how important you feel these issues are in your own home market? Protecting retail display space comes out top, as it did last year, was 7.9. What has leapt up, and has leapt up from fourth into equal first, is data, and particularly wholesaler data for marketing analysis and for controlling the supply chain and copy allocation. Much higher than retail EPOS data. I think there still are questions about how clean EPOS data actually is and how much effort needs to be put into cleansing it, but wholesaler data is already there. Creating innovative retail promotions, critically important and holding its number 3 position. Copy allocation at retail rising up, EPOS data, and then there's a big gap between these two, sales-based replenishment and pay-on-scan, scan-based trading. For one main reason is that neither of these two processes are operating in every market. There is a sense that sales-based replenishment has got dropping scores year on year. And there were some comments that it's a nice to have rather than something that is going to transform the business and the supply chain in their area. And also, it's very much driven by the number of deliveries per week. In the UK, we have a fairly unique system where magazines piggyback on the daily newspaper delivery. So we've got 5 to 6 deliveries per week for magazines. So sales-based replenishment works in the UK, whereas it doesn't work to the same extent in 1 delivery per week or 2 delivery per weeks in magazines. Pay on scan clearly is a controversial issue which has got zealots on both sides of the fence for that. On the pro side, it's mainly retailers rather than anybody else involved in the supply chain. But the scores are increasing here. This is coming on the agenda more as one way of streamlining, and it's the retailer's sort of neutron bomb way of trying to streamline the processes is pay on scan. So, a quick scamper through the survey. Let's just zoom in on some of the key issues and conclusions. It clearly is a challenging environment, however you look at it, with digital disruption and the drift into subscriptions. There are some challenging distribution issues, retail pressures, the cost pressures on wholesalers and distributors, logistics and costs rising up, and this niggling issue about cover prices, and do we need to take a more strategic view in the short term, the next year or so, in terms of cover pricing. But there are some bright spots that the companies involved in this process are seeing improved operational performance. There are economies which are coming back. There are significant and profitable product niches, particularly in the magazine sector. And as Juan has alluded to, and as in the panel session, of being able to identify those, create the right products and charge more for them. But I think what also comes through very strongly is an underlying belief that we have got quality and creative products as long as we can adapt them for the increasingly discerning consumer. but there is a strong belief that the core of what we are actually selling to the consumer is actually very high quality indeed. So behind all these objective trends, I think there are changing attitudes, and this is a big change between the last year's survey and this year's survey. I think going back 2 or 3 years, there was a lot of denial in the international supply chain that as long as we keep plugging away, doing what we're doing, things will improve. And I think that there are still companies out there who still believe that, who will get plastered, who will get absolutely stuffed in the future. They are still in denial. But there's been a general trend away from that. This is like sort of Alcoholics Anonymous or a self-help group of going from denial to depression is the next one. Just running out of steam, waiting for the camper van and their tour around New Zealand to come on the horizon. And just if we can just keep plugging for another 2 or 3 years, I'm out of this. And there is that element as well. There's a fascinating article recently in the Harvard Business Review, which is saying, look at the age of your CEO to know how much innovation and change is actually going to take place within your organization over the next 3 years. But we are now moving into this phase of determination, a new mood. And I think it's reflected in what we've heard this afternoon of being more creative and proactive, but also more questioning and challenging what each link in the chain does and how they do it, being one of those uncomfortable questions. There are still some difficult decisions ahead. There are still some difficult conversations, some blunt conversations to be had with people within the supply chain. But there is a new sense of speed and agility and can-do, and of the data tools that lie behind it in order to drive and manage a much more efficient supply chain. So, as we move from denial and depression to determination, that's what this year's survey looks like. Thank you very much.